June 1940. The world holds its breath, watching a continent crumble. It's a month that will forever be seared into the memory of civilization, a time of unprecedented speed, shock, and despair. In just a few short weeks, the old order of Europe, a balance of power that had existed for centuries, was not just challenged, it was obliterated. The German war machine, the Wehrmacht, seemed less like an army and more like a force of nature, a steel hurricane sweeping across the land, and in its path nations that had stood for 1,000 years were brought to their knees. The story of this collapse begins with the unthinkable, the fall of France. For generations, the French army was considered the most powerful land force in the world. It was the bedrock of European security, the guarantor of treaties, the shield against which any aggressor would supposedly break. Behind the supposed impregnability of the Maginot Line, France felt secure. But the German strategy was one of audacious, genius, and terrifying velocity. They didn't bother with the front door. Instead, they kicked in the side wall, punching through the Ardennes forest, a region thought impassable for tanks. The result was a catastrophe. The German panzer divisions, spearheaded by brilliant commanders like Guderian and Rommel, didn't fight a battle of attrition. They fought a battle of movement. They sliced through the Allied lines, encircling entire armies, creating chaos and severing communication. The French and British forces were bewildered. They were trained for a repeat of World War I, a static war of trenches and grinding advances. Instead, they faced blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was a new doctrine, a symphony of combined arms tanks, dive bombers, and infantry working in perfect, terrifying harmony. In just 6 weeks, it was over. The French armies, once the pride of Europe, were shattered. The government fled Paris, first to Tours, then to Bordeaux, a government in name only, chasing its own shadow as the state disintegrated. On June 14th, German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. The images were surreal, nightmarish. The swastika flag was hoisted over the Arc de Triomphe and the Eiffel Tower. Paris, the city of light, the cultural heart of the Western world, was now an occupied capital, its streets eerily quiet, its people stunned into silence. A sense of profound, soul-crushing defeat settled over the nation. For the rest of the world, if France could fall, and fall so quickly, what hope was there for anyone else? For the British Expeditionary Force, the campaign was a desperate scramble for survival. Pinned against the coast of Dunkirk, with their backs to the sea and the German pincers closing in, their annihilation seemed certain. What followed was a miracle of deliverance, but also a strategic disaster. An armada of little ships, fishing boats, yachts, civilian ferries set sail from England to rescue the stranded soldiers. Over 8 days, under constant air attack, they managed to evacuate over 300,000 Allied troops. Britain celebrated the Dunkirk spirit, a moment of national unity and resilience. But the reality was grim. The men came home, but their equipment did not. Nearly all of their tanks, artillery, and heavy vehicles were left abandoned on the beaches of France. The British Army was, for all intents and purposes, disarmed. It had soldiers, but no tools to fight a modern war. Britain was now alone, a small island staring across a narrow channel at a continent completely dominated by its enemy. Think of the map of Europe in May 1940, and then look at it again at the end of June. The change is breathtaking. One by one, the dominoes had fallen. Warsaw had been crushed the previous September. Copenhagen and Oslo were taken in a swift campaign in April. Then came the May offensive. Brussels, Amsterdam, Luxembourg, and finally, the crown jewel, Paris. The capitals of free Europe were now under German occupation. From the North Cape of Norway down to the Spanish border, the continent was a Nazi fortress. The jackboots of the Wehrmacht echoed in the ancient streets of a dozen conquered cities. This was the zenith of Hitler's power. He was the undisputed master of the continent. His every gamble had paid off. His every prediction of swift victory had come true. In Berlin, there was jubilation. To many Germans, and even to some outside observers, he seemed like a figure of destiny, a visionary who had erased the shame of the Versailles Treaty and forged a new, dominant German Empire. The world watched in a mixture of horror and awe. The speed and totality of the German victory had no precedent. It defied all military and political logic. In London, the atmosphere was thick with a unique blend of defiance and dread. The summer of 1940 was beautiful, with long, warm, sunny days. But this idyllic weather only made the sense of impending doom more surreal. People would look up at the clear blue skies and not see beauty, but an open pathway for the bombers of the Luftwaffe. Gas masks became a part of daily life. Children were evacuated from the cities. The iconic iron railings from parks and squares were torn down, melted to be used for weapons and munitions. The nation was bracing for an invasion that everyone believed was imminent. Internationally, Britain was utterly isolated. The Soviet Union was locked in a non-aggression pact with Germany, jointly carving up Poland. Italy, sensing a chance to pick up the spoils, had declared war on France and Britain, stabbing its neighbor in the back. In the United States, public opinion was strongly isolationist. The idea of getting dragged into another European war was deeply unpopular. President Roosevelt offered moral support and whatever material aid he could, but America's hands were tied by neutrality acts. Most foreign embassies in London, including the American one, expected Britain to fold. The rational choice, the strategic calculation, was to negotiate, to make peace with Hitler. Why fight a war you have already lost? This was the question facing Britain's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He had only been in office since May, a leader long dismissed as a warmonger and a has-been. Now, he was the last man standing. His war cabinet was divided. Influential figures like Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, argued that it was time to be realistic, to see what terms could be reached with Hitler through the still neutral Mussolini. It was a tempting argument. To continue the fight seemed like a national suicide pact. It promised only blood, bombs, and destruction, with no clear path to victory. But Churchill was having none of it. In a series of tense, crucial cabinet meetings, he argued, cajoled, and thundered. He argued that a deal with Hitler would make Britain a slave state, a puppet regime subject to the whims of a dictator. He believed that negotiating from a position of such weakness would lead to total submission. The British Empire, its freedom, its very soul, would be lost. For Churchill, there was no alternative. There was only the fight. His famous speeches from this period were not just political rhetoric. They were a lifeline to the British people and a declaration to the world. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. These words were a jolt of electricity to a nation gripped by fear. He didn't offer false hope or an easy victory. He offered blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He offered a vision of Britain as the last bastion of freedom, the final hope for a conquered Europe. And in this darkest of hours, the British people, against all odds and against all logic, chose to believe him. June 1940 was the moment of Europe's collapse. It was a time of fear, confusion, and seemingly irretrievable defeat. The lights had gone out across the continent, one by one, and as the German Reich stood at the peak of its power, ready to deliver the final blow, a small island, alone and vulnerable, steeled itself for the storm. It was here, in the skies over Britain and in the hearts of its people, that the tide of the war would have to turn. The Battle of Britain was about to begin, and with it, the fight for the future of the world. May 1940. Europe is teetering on the brink of collapse. The relentless German war machine has swept through country after country, and now, France, Britain's last major ally on the continent, is buckling. The situation is desperate. In London, amidst the political chaos and the looming shadow of defeat, one man steps into the storm. His name is Winston Churchill, and he is about to become Prime Minister. This wasn't a glorious ascension. It was a crisis appointment. The previous government, led by Neville Chamberlain, had lost the confidence of Parliament. His policy of appeasement had failed spectacularly. Britain needed a new leader, a fighter, and in Churchill, they found one. But his own party was deeply divided. Many, including prominent figures like Lord Halifax, believed the war was lost. They saw the overwhelming might of the German forces and argued that a negotiated peace, however painful, was the only logical path to save the nation from total destruction. The pressure on Churchill to seek terms with Hitler was immense, coming from within his own war cabinet. Imagine the scene. Churchill, a man of 65, finally achieving the office he had craved his entire life. But under the darkest circumstances imaginable, he walks into the cabinet war rooms, the underground bunker that would become the nerve center of Britain's war effort. The air is thick with tension and cigar smoke. On his desk are grim military assessments, each one a catalogue of disaster. The British Expeditionary Force is trapped in France. It's back to the sea at a little port town called Dunkirk. The Royal Air Force is outnumbered. The threat of a full-scale invasion of Britain is no longer a possibility. It's an imminent probability. Any other leader might have crumbled. Any other leader might have listened to the voices of reason, the calls for a pragmatic peace. But Churchill was not any other leader. He was a force of nature, a man fueled by an unshakable conviction. He saw Hitler not as a traditional political opponent, but as a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. For Churchill, this wasn't a war over territory or resources. This was a war for the very soul of civilization. He believed that negotiating with such an evil was not only a betrayal but a delusion. Peace with Hitler's regime, he argued, would be a temporary respite, a prelude to enslavement. Freedom itself was on the line. So, while others deliberated over the terms of surrender, Churchill prepared for defiance. He paced the narrow corridors of the war rooms, a bulldog figure, perpetually wreathed in the smoke of his trademark cigars. He worked relentlessly, often late into the night, fueled by a ferocious energy that exhausted his staff. He didn't just read the dire reports. He challenged them, demanded solutions, and instilled a sense of purpose in everyone around him. His confidence was not based on a denial of the facts. He knew the situation was catastrophic, but his belief was rooted in something deeper: the resilience of the British people and the moral righteousness of their cause. And then he spoke, not just to his cabinet, but to the nation and to the world. Using the power of radio, his voice, with its unique, gravelly cadence, became a weapon of war. He didn't offer false hope or easy promises. He offered the opposite. In his first speech as Prime Minister to the House of Commons, he famously declared, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." It was a stark, brutal, and electrifying message. He was telling the British people that the path ahead would be agonizing, but he was also telling them that they had the strength to walk it. As France collapsed and the evacuation from Dunkirk began, the calls for negotiation reached a fever pitch. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was convinced that Britain must find out what terms Germany might offer. It was the moment of maximum danger, not just on the battlefield, but within the British government itself. For several days in late May, the War Cabinet debated the issue intensely. Churchill stood almost alone. He argued. He cajoled. He thundered. He painted a picture of a Britain reduced to a slave state under Hitler's thumb, its navy and empire handed over to a tyrant. He appealed to their sense of history, their honor, and their courage. In a pivotal moment, he told his cabinet, nations which went down, fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished. He made it clear that if he were to be forced to negotiate, he would no longer lead them. He was prepared to resign rather than preside over a surrender. It was a monumental gamble batted work it. He rallied his ministers, convincing them that the only path forward, however perilous, was to fight, and to fight on, alone if necessary. With the political battle won, he turned his full attention to the people. On June 4, after the miracle of Dunkirk had saved over 300,000 Allied soldiers from capture, he delivered one of the most powerful speeches in history. He spoke of the colossal military disaster, but he framed the evacuation not as a retreat, but as a deliverance. And then came the words that would echo through the decades, a defiant roar against the might of the Nazi Empire. "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields, and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was the transfusion of his own indomitable will into the spirit of a nation. People who had felt surrounded and hopeless suddenly felt a surge of defiance. He gave them a voice for their own fears and their own courage. He made them believe that their struggle was not just for their own survival, but for the future of freedom in the world. He transformed the grim reality of their isolation into a badge of honor. Britain was now the last bastion, the final hope. The contrast was staggering. On one hand, the cold, hard intelligence reports detailing German invasion plans, the numerical superiority of the Luftwaffe, and the vulnerability of British shipping. On the other, this one man, standing before a microphone, his words painting a picture of unconquerable resistance. He didn't lie about the danger. He magnified it, and then he dared the people to face it with him. He made them partners in his defiance. This was Churchill's genius. He understood that wars are not won by weapons alone, but by will. And in the dark summer of 1940, as Britain stood alone, its fate hanging by a thread, Winston Churchill's voice was its greatest weapon, its strongest shield, and its most enduring source of hope. He didn't just lead a country, he embodied its spirit of defiance. July 19th, 1940. The scene is Berlin, inside the Kroll Opera House, which now serves as the right. Swastika banners hang from every balcony, a sea of red, white, and black. The air is thick with anticipation. Europe lies at Germany's feet. France, the great rival, has been humbled in a matter of weeks. The Low Countries are occupied. Poland is a memory. Only one major power remains standing, defiant across the narrow channel. Great Britain. Adolf Hitler steps up to the podium. He's not the frenzied, screaming demagogue of his early rallies. Today, he is a statesman, a conqueror, a self-proclaimed man of reason. He stands before his puppet parliament, his generals seated in the front rows, their chests gleaming with newly awarded medals. The field marshals, fresh from their triumphs in France, look on. This is a victory celebration, a display of absolute power. The world is watching. The broadcast is being carried live across the globe. Everyone wants to know the same thing. What comes next? Hitler begins to speak, his voice calm, measured, almost gracious. He recounts the recent victories, praising the genius of his commanders and the unmatched courage of the German soldier. He paints a picture of an invincible war machine that has crushed all who stood in its way. The campaign in the West, he declares, is the most glorious victory in German history. But then, his tone shifts. He isn't here just to boast. He is here, he claims, to make an appeal to reason. He turns his attention to Britain. He expresses what sounds like genuine bewilderment. Why does this island nation continue to fight? The war on the continent is over. Germany is supreme. He claims he never wanted this conflict with the British Empire, an empire he professes to admire. He says it brings him pain to even contemplate the destruction that must follow if Britain does not see sense. In this hour, he says, I feel it to be my duty before my own conscience to appeal once more to reason and common sense in Great Britain as well. I can see no reason why this war must go on. This is the core of his message, what German propaganda will later hail as his final peace appeal. It's a masterclass in political theater. To the German people and too many neutral observers, it sounds magnanimous. Here is the conqueror at the height of his power, offering an olive branch to his defeated foe. He isn't demanding unconditional surrender. He is simply asking for Britain to recognize the new reality in Europe. He wants them to accept Germany's dominance on the continent in exchange for keeping their own empire. It sounds so reasonable, so logical. The German propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, goes into overdrive. Newspapers splash headlines like Hitler's last appeal to reason. Radio broadcasts emphasize the Führer's sincere desire for peace, his wish to spare the world further bloodshed. The speech is presented as a historic opportunity, a chance for Britain to avoid a terrible fate. It has a carefully constructed image of a leader who has won the war and now wishes only to build a lasting peace. But beneath this veneer of magnanimity, There is a deep well of frustration and a barely concealed threat. Hitler is genuinely puzzled by British defiance. In his worldview, based on power and racial hierarchy, Britain should have recognized its defeat after the fall of France. The shopkeepers of England should have seen that holding out was irrational. Their continued resistance, led by the stubborn Winston Churchill, is an affront to his sense of order and his strategic calculations. As the speech continues, the underlying menace becomes clearer. Interspersed with his appeals to common sense are dark warnings. He speaks of the immense suffering that awaits the British people if they refuse his offer. He reminds them of the power of his Luftwaffe. He paints a grim picture of cities bombed into rubble, of a great empire brought to its knees. He makes it clear that if this peace appeal is rejected, he will unleash a storm of fire and steel upon Britain, the likes of which the world has never seen. He mocks Churchill directly, portraying him as a warmonger, a man drunk on power, who is leading his country to ruin for his own selfish ambitions. Hitler suggests that Churchill and his clique are the only obstacles to peace. He is attempting to drive a wedge between the British government and its people, hoping that the public, fearing the promised blitz, will pressure their leaders to negotiate. He says, "Mr. Churchill ought to for once believe me when I prophesy that a great empire will be destroyed, empire which it was never my intention to destroy or even to harm." The threat is crystal clear. He is framing the potential destruction of the British Empire, not as an act of German aggression, but as the direct consequence of Churchill's stubbornness. It's a classic manipulation tactic. Look what you are making me do. The speech is built on a fundamental assumption that Britain is a rational actor that will now choose the path of least resistance. Hitler believes he has left them no other choice. They are isolated. Their main ally has collapsed. The United States is still officially neutral. From his perspective in Berlin, surrounded by victorious generals, negotiation seems like the only logical path for London. He believes he's backed them into a corner. He has offered them a way out that allows them to save face, to keep their empire, and to avoid annihilation. What Hitler fundamentally misunderstands is the British mindset at that moment. He sees their island geography as a weakness. They see it as their fortress. He sees their defiance as irrational. They see it as their finest hour. He underestimates their resolve, their national pride, and the leadership of Churchill, who'd already promised them nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. For Britain, this isn't a negotiation over European territory. It's a fight for survival, for freedom, for the very soul of their nation. So, while Hitler speaks of peace in Berlin, his words are heard very differently in London. The British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, gives its official response shortly after. The announcer's tone is cool, dismissive, almost bored. He simply states, "We are told he has made an appeal to what he calls our reason and common sense. We shall not be the first to be impressed by an appeal to reason from that source. The rejection is swift and total. There will be no negotiation. There will be no surrender." Hitler's great peace offensive has failed before it even began. His frustration turns to fury. The British have called his bluff. The man who saw himself as a master of psychology had made a colossal miscalculation. He had offered what he thought was a golden bridge, but Britain had chosen to fight on from the far shore. The consequences of this rejection would be immediate and terrible. The failure of the peace appeal directly led to the next phase of the conflict, the Battle of Britain. Hitler, his pride wounded and his strategic timetable disrupted, would now turn the full might of the Luftwaffe against the island he had failed to intimidate. The speech of July 19, 1940, intended to be the grand finale of his war in the West, instead became the prologue to one of the most decisive aerial campaigns in history. The conqueror who had offered a reasonable peace would now try to achieve his goals through brute force, setting the stage for the epic struggle in the skies over England that would change the course of the war. Hello and welcome back to our deep dive into the pivotal moments of World War II. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a decision that shaped the course of history, a choice made in the secret heart of the British government, long before the public knew. This is the story of Churchill's secret resolve. In the harrowing days of 1940, with France on the brink of collapse, and the British Army cornered at Dunkirk, a spectre haunted the halls of Whitehall. A negotiated peace with Hitler. Too many, it seemed like irrational, even inevitable, option to save Britain from destruction. But what the public didn't know was that for Winston Churchill and his inner circle, the decision had already been made. Peace with Hitler was never an option. Weeks before the dramatic Dunkirk evacuation, Churchill's war cabinet had engaged in some of the most intense and soul-searching debates of the entire war. The central question wasn't if they should fight, but how they could possibly continue. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, represented a powerful faction that believed exploring a peace deal through intermediaries like Mussolini was a pragmatic necessity. He argued that if Britain could secure its independence and the integrity of the empire, why not listen to what terms were on the table? To him, it was a matter of statesmanship, of saving the nation from a seemingly unwinnable war. But Churchill saw it differently. His opposition wasn't just strategic, it was profoundly moral. He had spent years warning the world about Hitler, studying his methods, his promises, and his betrayals. Intelligence assessments flowing into the cabinet war rooms painted a consistent picture. Hitler's word was worthless. Any treaty, any agreement, would be a mere scrap of paper, a temporary pause for the Nazi war machine to regroup before its next assault. Churchill was convinced that Hitler's ultimate goal was not just continental dominance, but the complete subjugation of all free peoples. In one fiery cabinet meeting, Churchill laid out his reasoning with chilling clarity. To even enter into negotiations, he argued, would be a catastrophic blow to British prestige and honor. It would signal weakness to the world, especially to the United States, whose support was Britain's lifeline. How could they ask America to stand with them against tyranny if they themselves were seen to be parling with the tyrant? Moretan that Churchill understood this psychological impact. The moment Britain considered peace, the national will to fight would crumble. The spirit of resistance, the very soul of the nation, would be poisoned. He painted a dark picture of what a negotiated peace would mean. Britain would be reduced to a slave state, a puppet of a Nazi-dominated Europe. The Royal Navy would be dismantled, the empire dismembered, and all the values they held dear: freedom, democracy, justice would be extinguished. For Churchill, this was not a political debate. It was a crusade. He believed that surrendering to Hitler would plunge Europe, and perhaps the world, into a new dark age, one made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. His arguments were powerful, but the pressure was immense. With every dire report from the front, the voices counseling caution grew louder. It was in these crucible moments that Churchill's leadership was forged. He wasn't just a prime minister. He was the nation's embodiment of defiance. He walked the corridors of power, sometimes emotional, sometimes banging the table for emphasis, insisting that this was a moment of absolute clarity. There was no middle ground, no compromise with evil. Finally, in a decisive session on May 28, 1940, Churchill galvanized his wavering cabinet. He declared that Britain was not the same nation it had been in the past. He spoke of the national mood, of the people's readiness to fight on, to endure whatever was thrown at them. He famously stated that if the long history of their island was to end at last, let it end only when each one of them was choking on his own blood upon the ground. It was a stark, brutal, and electrifying statement. He wasn't just offering a strategy, he was offering a destiny. He concluded with a vow that would echo through the ages, a commitment made not just to his colleagues, but to history itself. Britain would fight on, he promised, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. With those words, the debate was over. The decision was sealed. It wasn't an impulsive act of a stubborn bulldog. It was the result of weeks of agonizing debate, careful intelligence analysis, and a deep, unshakable moral conviction. Britain would not entertain any peace proposal. They would fight. So, when Hitler later made his so-called last appeal to reason in a public speech, it fell on deaf ears in London. The British response, a curt and dismissive broadcast, may have seemed arrogant to the outside world, but for those in the know, it was simply the public expression of a secret resolve forged in the darkest hours. The path ahead was terrifyingly uncertain. Invasion seemed imminent, and the resources for a long war were perilously thin. But the moral compass was set. Churchill had bet everything on the courage of the British people and the eventual triumph of their cause. It was a gamble that would save the world. 1940. The world held its breath. On one side of the English Channel stood Adolf Hitler, the Führer of a triumphant Germany. His vision was one of iron and blood, a new European order built on racial hierarchy and absolute, authoritarian control. He saw democracy as weak, decadent, a chaotic relic of a bygone era. For him, the future belonged to the strong, the ruthless, the racially pure, all marching in lockstep to the will of one leader. Germany, under his rule, was a machine efficient, powerful, and utterly devoid of dissent. Every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every public gathering was a carefully orchestrated performance, reinforcing the myth of the thousand-year Reich. The individual existed only to serve the state. On the other side stood Winston Churchill, the bulldog embodiment of an entirely different world. He represented Britain, a messy, argumentative, gloriously inefficient democracy. Churchill's ideology was rooted in centuries of parliamentary tradition, in the belief that freedom of speech wasn't just a right, but the very engine of national strength. He cherished the chaos of debate in the House of Commons, the loud, dissenting voices of a free press, and the fundamental right of a person to live without fear of a midnight knock on the door. For Churchill, the state existed to serve the individual, not the other way around. His writings and speeches weren't commands from on high. They were arguments, appeals to reason, and calls to the heart of a free people. When Hitler extended his so-called peace offer in the summer of 1940, it wasn't a genuine negotiation. It was a challenge, a declaration of ideological war. He wasn't just offering to end the fighting. He was offering Britain a place in his new world order, a subordinate place, of course. He expected Britain, seeing the might of his armies, to bow to the inevitable. Hitler saw Churchill's refusal as madness, the stubborn pride of a dying empire. He couldn't comprehend that Britain wasn't just defending its island. It was defending an idea. The idea that a nation could be strong, because it was free, not in spite of it. Let's look at their own words. Hitler's speeches are filled with a chilling, almost mystical He speaks of destiny, of providence, of the sacred mission of the German race. His language is absolute, demanding total obedience. He promised his people order and glory, but the price was their freedom, their conscience. He built a society on fear and conformity, where the highest virtue was unquestioning loyalty. In private, his contempt for the democratic process was even more stark. He saw the bickering of politicians as a sign of racial decay, a weakness to be exploited. He believed history was a brutal struggle for survival, where only the most ruthless would prevail. Germany was his instrument, a nation forged into a weapon. Now, listen to Churchill. His words ring with a different kind of power. He doesn't command, he persuades. He appeals to history, to courage, to honor. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be, he famously declared. It wasn't a boast. It was a promise made on behalf of a free people. He spoke of the great principles of freedom and the rights of man as the joint inheritance of the English-speaking world. He admitted Britain's imperfections, embraced the noisy arguments of its democracy, because he understood that this was the source of its resilience. While Germany was a silent, monolithic pyramid with Hitler at the peak, Britain was a loud, sprawling, and sometimes chaotic city, full of different voices all arguing about the best way forward. This contrast was visible everywhere. In Berlin, massive, perfectly staged rallies celebrated the unity of the Volk under one will. The individual was lost in the crowd, a tiny cog in a vast machine of state power. In London, people queued for newspapers filled with competing headlines, argued in pubs over government policy, and wrote angry letters to their members of parliament. Churchill himself had to face a relentless barrage of criticism in the House of Commons. Even at the height of the war, he had to justify his decisions, debate his critics, and win the argument, day after day. Hitler only had to give an order. So, when Churchill rejected Hitler's peace offer, he wasn't just making a strategic calculation. He was making a moral choice. He was declaring that the world of free speech, of individual rights, of messy, vibrant democracy was worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. Hitler's offer was a test. Would Europe submit to the cold, efficient logic of totalitarianism, or would it fight for the chaotic, unpredictable, and ultimately more human world of freedom? The German worldview saw compromise as weakness and freedom as chaos. The British worldview, championed by Churchill, saw compromise as the basis of politics and freedom as the wellspring of strength. The Battle of Britain, which followed that summer, was therefore more than just a battle for air superiority. It was a clash of these two irreconcilable ideologies, played out in the skies over southern England. The pilots of the RF, the few, were not just defending their homes. They were the armed defenders of a free society against a tyrannical one. They were the sharp point of Churchill's defiance, the living embodiment of a nation that chose to fight for its values, rather than surrender them for a false peace. This fundamental divide between a world where the state is everything and the individual is nothing, and a world where the state serves the free individual was the true heart of the conflict. Hitler believed he was the future. He saw his tightly controlled dictatorship as the next stage of human evolution, a more advanced form of society. Churchill, in his rumpled suit and with his defiant cigar, stood for the enduring power of the past and the messy promise of a free future. He gambled everything on the belief that free men and women, when faced with an existential threat, would find a strength within themselves that no dictator could ever command. The decision made in 1940 wasn't just about Britain's survival. It was a decision that would define the moral landscape of the modern world. The two worlds had collided, and only one could emerge victorious. 1940. The world held its breath. On one side of the English Channel stood Adolf Hitler, the Führer of a triumphant Germany. His vision was one of iron and blood, a new European order built on racial hierarchy and absolute, authoritarian control. He saw democracy as weak, decadent, a chaotic relic of a bygone era. For him, the future belonged to the strong, the ruthless, the racially pure, all marching in lockstep to the will of one leader. Germany, under his rule, was a machine efficient, powerful, and utterly devoid of dissent. Every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every public gathering was a carefully orchestrated performance, reinforcing the myth of the Thousand-Year Reich. The individual existed only to serve the state. On the other side stood Winston Churchill, the bulldog embodiment of an entirely different world. He represented Britain, a messy, argumentative, gloriously inefficient democracy. Churchill's ideology was rooted in centuries of parliamentary tradition, in the belief that freedom of speech wasn't just a right, but the very engine of national strength. He cherished the chaos of debate in the House of Commons, the loud, dissenting voices of a free press, and the fundamental right of a person to live without fear of a midnight knock on the door. For Churchill, the state existed to serve the individual, not the other way around. His writings and speeches weren't commands from on high. They were arguments, appeals to reason, and calls to the heart of a free people. When Hitler extended his so-called peace offer in the summer of 1940, it wasn't a genuine negotiation. It was a challenge, a declaration of ideological war. He wasn't just offering to end the fighting. He was offering Britain a place in his new world order, a subordinate place, of course. He expected Britain, seeing the might of his armies, to bow to the inevitable. Hitler saw Churchill's refusal as madness, the stubborn pride of a dying empire. He couldn't comprehend that Britain wasn't just defending its island. It was defending an idea. The idea that a nation could be strong, because it was free, not in spite of it. Let's look at their own words. Hitler's speeches are filled with a chilling, almost mystical He speaks of destiny, of providence, of the sacred mission of the German race. His language is absolute, demanding total obedience. He promised his people order and glory, but the price was their freedom, their conscience. He built a society on fear and conformity, where the highest virtue was unquestioning loyalty. In private, his contempt for the democratic process was even more stark. He saw the bickering of politicians as a sign of racial decay, a weakness to be exploited. He believed history was a brutal struggle for survival, where only the most ruthless would prevail. Germany was his instrument, a nation forged into a weapon. Now, listen to Churchill. His words ring with a different kind of power. He doesn't command, he persuades. He appeals to history, to courage, to honor. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be," he famously declared. It wasn't a boast. It was a promise made on behalf of a free people. He spoke of the great principles of freedom and the rights of man as the joint inheritance of the English-speaking world. He admitted Britain's imperfections, embraced the noisy arguments of its democracy, because he understood that this was the source of its resilience. While Germany was a silent, monolithic pyramid with Hitler at the peak, Britain was a loud, sprawling, and sometimes chaotic city, full of different voices all arguing about the best way forward. This contrast was visible everywhere. In Berlin, massive, perfectly staged rallies celebrated the unity of the Volk under one will. The individual was lost in the crowd, a tiny cog in a vast machine of state power. In London, people queued for newspapers filled with competing headlines, argued in pubs over government policy, and wrote angry letters to their members of parliament. Churchill himself had to face a relentless barrage of criticism in the House of Commons. Even at the height of the war, he had to justify his decisions, debate his critics, and win the argument day after day. Hitler only had to give an order. So, when Churchill rejected Hitler's peace offer, he wasn't just making a strategic calculation. He was making a moral choice. He was declaring that the world of free speech, of individual rights, of messy, vibrant democracy was worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. Hitler's offer was a test. Would Europe submit to the cold, efficient logic of totalitarianism, or would it fight for the chaotic, unpredictable, and ultimately more human world of freedom? The German worldview saw compromise as weakness and freedom as chaos. The British worldview, championed by Churchill, saw compromise as the basis of politics and freedom as the wellspring of strength. The Battle of Britain, which followed that summer, was therefore more than just a battle for air superiority. It was a clash of these two irreconcilable ideologies, played out in the skies over southern England. The pilots of the RF, the few, were not just defending their homes. They were the armed defenders of a free society against a tyrannical one. They were the sharp point of Churchill's defiance, the living embodiment of a nation that chose to fight for its values, rather than surrender them for a false peace. This fundamental divide between a world where the state is everything and the individual is nothing, and a world where the state serves the free individual was the true heart of the conflict. Hitler believed he was the future. He saw his tightly controlled dictatorship as the next stage of human evolution, a more advanced form of society. Churchill, in his rumpled suit and with his defiant cigar, stood for the enduring power of the past and the messy promise of a free future. He gambled everything on the belief that free men and women, when faced with an existential threat, would find a strength within themselves that no dictator could ever command. The decision made in 1940 wasn't just about Britain's survival. It was a decision that would define the moral landscape of the modern world. The two worlds had collided, and only one could emerge victorious. The fall of France in June 1940 was a seismic shock. From the shores of Norway down to the Spanish border, Hitler's war machine now controlled the entire western coast of Europe. Across the narrow channel, a mere 20 miles of water, stood Great Britain, defiant, but terrifyingly alone. The British Expeditionary Force had been miraculously evacuated from Dunkirk, but they had left behind nearly all their heavy equipment. The army was a shadow of its former self, armed with little more than rifles and raw courage. Invasion seemed not just possible, but imminent. In this darkest of hours, a new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, addressed the nation. His voice, gravelly and resolute, crackled through radios in every home. He offered not easy victory, but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He spoke of fighting on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, and in the streets, promising they would never surrender. For a nation staring into the abyss, these words were not just rhetoric, they were a lifeline. A call to arms that ignited a fire of defiance in the hearts of millions. And the nation responded. Britain transformed itself into a fortress, not overnight, but with a frantic, desperate energy. This wasn't just a job for soldiers. It was a task for every man, woman, and child. On the picturesque southern coast, beaches were laced with miles of barbed wire and concrete anti-tank obstacles called Dragon's Teeth. Golf courses were dotted with pits and trenches, their fairways dug up to prevent enemy gliders from landing. Signposts were taken down across the entire country. A simple but ingenious plan to confuse and disorient any invading paratroopers. The civilian population mobilized in a way never seen before. Over 1.5 million men, many of them too old or too young for the regular army, flocked to join the local defense volunteers, soon renamed the Home Guard. They were a motley crew, initially armed with whatever they could find: shotguns, ancient hunting rifles, agricultural tools, and even pikes. They were derisively nicknamed Dad's Army, but their purpose was deadly serious. They trained in their spare time, learning guerrilla tactics, how to spot enemy aircraft, and how to make petrol bombs. They stood watch every night, guarding bridges, factories, and coastlines, the last line of defense for their homes. Fear of the fifth column, spies and saboteurs living among them, gripped the public. Propaganda posters warned that careless talk costs lives, and a wave of spy fever swept the nation. Anyone with a foreign-sounding accent could fall under suspicion. It was a time of intense paranoia, but it also fostered a sense of shared vigilance. Everyone was a sentry. One of the most heart-wrenching aspects of this period was the mass evacuation of children. Under a program called Operation Pied Piper, millions of children were sent away from the industrial cities, which were prime targets for bombing, waving goodbye to their parents, with gas masks and cardboard boxes slung over their shoulders and labels tied to their coats. They boarded trains for the unfamiliar quiet of the countryside. It was a colossal, emotional upheaval, a sacrifice made to protect the next generation from the horrors to come. For many children, it was an adventure. For others, a deeply traumatic separation from everything they knew. Meanwhile, British industry underwent a total conversion to war production. Car factories began churning out tanks and aircraft. Small workshops that once made pots and pans were now manufacturing shell casings and components for machine guns. The government's Minister of Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook, drove the effort with relentless urgency. He launched a nationwide campaign asking for aluminum, famously calling on housewives to donate their pots and pans to be melted down and turned into Spitfires and Hurricanes. While the practical value was debatable, the psychological impact was immense. It made everyone feel like they were contributing directly to the defense of the realm. As the summer of 1940 wore on, the fear of invasion gave way to the reality of aerial assault. The Battle of Britain began. Every day, the skies above southern England became a vast, three-dimensional battlefield. People on the ground would stop what they were doing and look up, watching the intricate, deadly ballet of dogfight. The white contrails of fighters weaving patterns against the blue canvas. The sound of the air raid siren became the soundtrack to daily life. The wail would send people scurrying into makeshift shelters in their gardens, known as Anderson shelters, or into the cramped, damp tunnels of the London Underground. Then, in September, the Blitz began. For 57 consecutive nights, London was pounded by the Luftwaffe. The nightly bombing brought the war directly to the civilian population. The sirens would sound, followed by the drone of bombers, the whistle of falling bombs, and the earth-shattering explosions that tore buildings and lives apart. The fires lit up the night sky, turning the horizon a hellish orange. Yet, amidst the destruction, an extraordinary spirit of resilience emerged. Firefighters, ambulance drivers, and air raid wardens worked tirelessly through the carnage. Neighbors pulled each other from the rubble. Canteens were set up to provide tea and comfort to the bombed-out families. The morning after a raid, the shopkeeper whose window had been blown out might put up a sign saying, "More open than usual." This Blitz spirit was a mixture of dark humor, stubbornness, and a profound sense of community. Strangers became friends in the shared experience of survival. Churchill himself would often tour the bombed-out areas, his presence a symbol of the nation's refusal to be broken. His speeches continued to inspire, broadcasts from a secret bunker deep beneath London, reminding the world that Britain was still fighting. While civilians endured the Blitz, the military was desperately rearming. The salvaged remnants of the army were re-equipped. Factories, running 24 hours a day, produced a torrent of new weapons. The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, had two crucial advantages: a state-of-the-art radar system that gave them early warning of incoming raids, and two of the finest fighter aircraft in the world. the Spitfire, and the Hurricane. The pilots, a mix of young Britons and volunteers from across the Commonwealth and occupied Europe, were pushed to the limits of human endurance. They became known as the Few, and as Churchill famously said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." By the end of 1940, Britain had survived. The Luftwaffe had failed to gain air superiority, and Hitler postponed, then cancelled, the invasion of Britain, turning his attention eastward towards the Soviet Union. The island fortress had held. The nation had been tested by fire, and it had not buckled. The resilience of ordinary people, the ingenuity of its industry, the bravery of its pilots, and the indomitable leadership of Churchill had combined to ensure that the light of freedom was not extinguished in Europe. Britain stood alone, bruised and battered, but undefeated, a beacon of hope in a world consumed by darkness. The fall of France in June 1940 should have been the end. For Adolf Hitler, it was a moment of supreme triumph. His armies had conquered most of Western Europe in a matter of weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been humiliatingly evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind its heavy equipment. From his perspective, the war was won. All that remained was for Britain to see reason and sue for peace. But Britain didn't. Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister, stood defiant, promising to fight on, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. This infuriated Hitler. The British were being stubborn, illogical. This defiance wasn't a strategic method. It was a political annoyance that needed to be dealt with. And so, born from this frustration, a new plan was hastily conceived. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain. The German High Command was thrown into a frenzy of activity. This wasn't a long-considered strategic objective like the invasion of France. This was an improvised solution to a political problem. In offices across Berlin, army generals, many of whom had never even considered a seaborne invasion, were now hunched over maps of the English coastline. They drew arrows and landing zones with a confidence that masked deep uncertainty. Men like Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, sketched out ambitious plans for massive landings from Kent to Dorset, envisioning panzer divisions rolling through the English countryside towards London. These were land warriors, masters of the blitzkrieg, now tasked with crossing the most heavily defended stretch of water in the world. Their diagrams were exercises in theoretical warfare, often ignoring the immense logistical nightmare of the sea. Meanwhile, at Luftwaffe headquarters, the mood was more arrogant, yet equally disconnected from naval reality. Hermann Rhin, the bombastic chief of the Air Force, assured Hitler that his pilots could achieve total air superiority over southern England. Luftwaffe officers began calculating bombing requirements with chilling precision. They planned to obliterate Royal Air Force airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. Gring believed that the RAF could be swept from the skies within days, or a few weeks at most. This, he argued, would be the key. Once the skies belonged to the Luftwaffe, the Royal Navy would be powerless to intervene against an invasion fleet. It was a bold, air-centric view of the battle to come, one that severely underestimated the resilience of the RAF and the formidable power of British naval tradition. But there was one voice of stark, sobering reality. Die Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, its commander, was aghast. He repeatedly warned Hitler and the High Command that the German Navy was simply not up to the task. The Kriegsmarine was a shadow of its British counterpart, the Royal Navy. It had suffered heavy losses during the Norwegian campaign, with many of its modern destroyers sunk or damaged. Raeder had a meager collection of cruisers and a handful of capital ships to face the might of the British home fleet. He famously told Hitler that sending an invasion fleet across the Channel would be like sending my troops into a meat grinder. Naval commanders laid out the brutal facts. They could not guarantee the safety of a single transport ship against the combined power of the Royal Navy and the RMS. Their proposed solution was a landing on a very narrow front, using a motley collection of converted river barges, tugboats, and steamers as transport. These vessels were flat-bottomed, slow, and completely unsuited for the choppy waters of the English Channel, let alone for a contested amphibious assault. Imagine the scene. A naval officer trying to explain the dangers of tides and currents to an army general who only thinks in terms of miles and tank formations. The officer would point out that the barges were unseaworthy, that they would be sitting ducks for British destroyers. The general would impatiently wave him away, talking about the speed of his panzers once they hit the beaches. There was a fundamental disconnect between the services. The army planned as if it were crossing a river. The Luftwaffe planned as if the sea didn't exist, and the Navy knew it was being asked to perform a suicide mission. The intensivist rivalry and lack of a unified command structure, which had been manageable on the continent, were now becoming a critical, perhaps fatal, flaw in the planning for Sea Lion. At the center of this chaotic planning was Hitler himself. In his headquarters, he would pace back and forth, studying massive maps of the English Channel and the British Isles. He was impatient, dismissive of the Navy's concerns. He saw the Channel not as a formidable naval barrier, but as a ditch to be crossed. His focus was on the land campaign that would follow. He issued directives with the tone of someone who expected the impossible to be made possible through sheer force of will. He set an ambitious timetable, initially demanding the invasion be ready by mid-August. When his naval staff presented the logistical impossibilities, he would fly into a rage, accusing them of cowardice or incompetence. Hitler's understanding of naval warfare was elementary at best. He was a continental strategist, a land animal. He failed to grasp the profound difference between conquering a neighboring country and launching an amphibious invasion against the world's premier naval power. His impatience drove the planning forward, but it was an impetus based on political need, not military logic. He needed a quick victory over Britain to secure his western flank before he could turn his attention east, towards his ultimate goal, the Soviet Union. The entire enterprise was built on a series of ifs. Operation Sea Lion could succeed. Asterisk. If asterisk, the Luftwaffe could destroy the RF. It could succeed, asterisk. If asterisk, the weather in the Channel held. It could succeed, asterisk, if asterisk, the Royal Navy was neutralized. It could succeed, asterisk, if asterisk, a makeshift fleet of river barges could somehow navigate the crossing and land an army. Each of these ifs was a monumental gamble. The plan wasn't a product of careful, long-term strategic thinking like the Schlieffen Plan of World War I or the Case Yellow Plan for the invasion of France. It was a reactive, hastily assembled concept born out of Hitler's frustration with Britain's refusal to surrender. It was a testament to the German military's hubris and its leaders' detachment from reality. The generals drew their lines on the map, the pilots prepared to fly, and the sailors looked to the sea with dread. The fate of the invasion, and perhaps the war itself, would first be decided not on the beaches of Kent, but in the skies above. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. Today we turn our attention to the summer of 1940, a time when the fate of an entire continent hung precariously in the balance, suspended not on land or sea but in the vast unforgiving skies over the English Channel. Following the stunningly rapid fall of France, the German war machine stood triumphant on the shores of continental Europe. Just across the narrow strait of water lay Great Britain, defiant and alone. The German High Command, led by Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, began drafting plans for an ambitious amphibious invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. It was a monumental undertaking, requiring the transport of hundreds of thousands of troops and their equipment across one of the world's most heavily defended waterways. However, a formidable obstacle stood in their way: the Royal Navy. The British fleet was a powerful force, capable of wreaking havoc on any invasion flotilla. German planners quickly came to a stark and unavoidable conclusion: an invasion would be suicidal unless they could first gain complete control of the air. The Royal Navy, however powerful, would be vulnerable to relentless air attack. If the Luftwaffe could neutralize the Royal Air Force, they could then turn their full might against the British ships, clearing the path for the invasion. The logic was simple and brutal: destroy the RF, and Britain would fall. Without air superiority, Operation Sea Lion was nothing more than a fantasy. And so, the stage was set for one of history's most decisive aerial campaigns, the Battle of Britain. The directive from Hitler was clear. The German Air Force was to overpower the English Air Force with all the forces at its command, in the shortest possible time. The Germans began their preparations with characteristic efficiency. Across occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Luftwaffe, airfields, buzzed with activity. Gring's forces were reorganized into 3 massive air fleets, or Luftflotte, based in the Port of Calais, would target the southeast of England, including London. Luftflotte 3, operating from Normandy and Brittany, would cover the west and southwest, and Luftflotte 5, stationed in Norway and Denmark, would strike the north. The backbone of their fighter force was the Messerschmitt Bf 109, a sleek, deadly aircraft that had proven itself in the skies over Spain and Poland. It was fast, well-armed, and flown by experienced, battle-hardened pilots, many of whom were already aces. Alongside the 109s were the twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110 destroyers, long-range heavy fighters designed to escort the bomber fleets. And those bomber fleets were vast, composed of Heinkel 111s, Dornier 17 Segundos, and the infamous Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers, whose terrifying siren became a symbol of the Blitz. German commanders were confident. They outnumbered the British in nearly every category of aircraft, and believed their pilots' combat experience would give them a decisive edge. Their strategy, initially, was to target British coastal convoys and ports. Luring the RF into a battle of attrition they were sure they could win. Meanwhile, across the Channel in Britain, a different kind of preparation was underway. A quiet, desperate urgency filled the air. At airfields scattered across the south of England, young men, many still in their late teens or early 20s, prepared to fly and to fight. These were the pilots of RAF, Fighter Command. They came from all walks of life, from Britain, the Commonwealth, and even from occupied nations like Poland and Czechoslovakia, all united by a common cause. Their steeds were 2 of the most iconic aircraft ever built, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. The Hurricane, a rugged and stable gun platform, was the workhorse of Fighter Command. It was responsible for shooting down more enemy aircraft during the Battle of Britain than all other defenses combined. It was tough, reliable, and could absorb significant damage and still bring its pilot home. Then there was the Spitfire, with its graceful elliptical wings and powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Spitfire was a masterpiece of aviation engineering. It was faster and more agile than the Hurricane, a thoroughbred fighter that could outturn the Bf 109 at certain altitudes. In the hands of a skilled pilot, he was a truly formidable opponent. Pilots spoke of the Spitfire with a kind of reverence. It wasn't just a machine, it was an extension of themselves. The atmosphere at the fighter stations was a strange mix of youthful bravado and nervous tension. Days were spent on standby, in a state of readiness known as at dispersal. Pilots would sit in wicker chairs by their aircraft, reading, playing cards, or simply waiting. They were a band of brothers, sharing jokes and fears, knowing that at any moment the scramble bell could ring. When it did, the calm would shatter. They would sprint to their cockpits, ground crews already working to start the engines. Within minutes, they would be airborne, climbing to meet the incoming waves of German bombers and their fighter escorts. But Britain had a secret weapon, a technological marvel that would prove to be one of the most critical factors in the battle. This was the Chain Home System, the world's first integrated air defense network. A chain of tall radar masts stood sentinel along the southern and eastern coasts of England, constantly scanning the skies. These stations could detect incoming enemy aircraft from over 100 miles away, giving the RAF precious time to react. Inside the filter rooms and operations centers, Women's Auxiliary Air Force personnel, or WWII, plotted the detected raids on massive maps. Information on the raids, height, speed, and direction was relayed to the headquarters of Fighter Command's 11 Group, which controlled the defense of London and the southeast. From his underground bunker at RF Uxbridge, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park could see the entire battle unfolding before him. He knew where the enemy was, where they were heading, and how many there were. This allowed him to manage his limited fighter squadrons with incredible efficiency, refusing to be drawn into Gring's trap of a massive aerial dogfight. Instead, he could vector his squadrons to intercept specific targets, conserving fuel and pilots, and meeting the enemy on his own terms. The radar system turned the vast sky into a manageable chessboard, and so, as the summer of 1940 began, the pieces were in place. The Luftwaffe, confident in its numbers and experience, prepared to launch Adlertagigul, day the opening of their main offensive, to annihilate the RF. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered but fighting over home turf, and armed with brilliant aircraft and a revolutionary defense system, steeled itself for the onslaught. The air above the green fields of Kent and Sussex was about to become the most important battlefield in the world. Both sides understood the stakes completely. The one who won control of the skies would not just win a battle, they would decide the fate of nations, and perhaps the future of the free world. In the summer of 1940, the fate of the free world hung by a thread, suspended in the skies over the English Channel. With most of Europe under the heel of the Nazi war machine, Britain stood alone, a final bastion against tyranny. Hitler, confident after his swift victories, prepared for an invasion, Operation Sea Lion. But before a single German soldier could set foot on British soil, the Luftwaffe had to achieve one critical objective: air superiority. They had to destroy the Royal Air Force. What followed was not just a battle, but an epic saga of courage, sacrifice, and defiance that would forever be known as the Battle of Britain. The assault began not with a bang, but with a low, menacing drone that grew louder and louder. Across the Channel, from newly captured airfields in France and Belgium, the Luftwaffe rose in force. Waves of Heinkel and Dornier bombers, escorted by a swarm of Messerschmitt, Bf 109 and 110 fighters, blotted out the summer sun. Their targets were the coastal convoys, the ports, and crucially, the RAF airfields and radar stations in the south of England. The Germans called it Adlatag Kahigolde, the beginning of a relentless campaign to break Britain's spirit and its air force. On the British side, the response was immediate and desperate. Deep underground in London, in the cramped, smoke-filled corridors of the cabinet war rooms, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his commanders watched the unfolding drama. On a massive map table, plotters moved wooden blocks representing enemy and friendly aircraft. A chillingly real-time game of chess where every piece was a human life. The air crackled with tension. Every report from the radar stations, every pilot's frantic radio call, painted a picture of an island under siege. The orders went out. Scramble. All across southern England, the piercing wail of air raid sirens sent civilians running for shelter and RAF pilots sprinting to their aircraft. They were young men, many barely out of their teens, from all walks of life: Britons, Poles, Czechs, Canadians, New Zealanders, and more. They were the few, as Churchill would later call them, climbing into the cramped cockpits of their Hurricanes and Spitfires. They were the nation's last line of defense. There was no time for long goodbyes or elaborate briefings. The klaxon sounded, and within minutes, they were airborne, climbing steeply to meet the enemy head-on. Imagine the scene: a sky once clear and blue, now a chaotic canvas of twisting, turning aircraft. The air is thick with the roar of engines, the chatter of machine guns, and the percussive thud of cannons. Trails of white smoke trace the graceful, deadly ballet of dogfights. A Spitfire, agile and deadly latches, onto the tail of a mess, its guns ripping into the German fighter's fuselage. Elsewhere, a Hurricane bravely plows into a formation of bombers, its 8 machine guns blazing, trying to break them up before they can reach their targets. For the pilots, it was a blur of adrenaline and instinct. Life and death were decided in seconds. A moment of hesitation, a glance in the wrong direction, and it was over. They were flying multiple sorties a day, landing only to refuel and rearm before taking off again. Exhaustion was a constant enemy, as potent as the Luftwaffe. The physical and mental strain was immense. Pilots would fall asleep over their meals, their hands still trembling from the vibrations of the cockpit. They saw their friends take off and never return, their bunks in the mess hall empty that night. Yet, every time the alarm sounded, they got back in their planes and went up again. Their bravery was almost superhuman. Down below, the war was no longer a distant event happening in foreign fields. It was here. Civilians watched the aerial battles unfold over their heads, a terrifying spectacle of war in their own backyards. The first bombs began to fall, not just on military targets, but on coastal towns and cities. The port of Dover, a gateway to Britain, became known as Hellfire Corner, due to the constant shelling and bombing raids. The explosions shook homes, shattered windows, and carved craters into familiar streets. The sharp, acrid smell of smoke and cordite filled the air. The human cost was staggering. Each plane that spiraled out of the sky, trailing a plume of black smoke, was a tragedy. It was a pilot, a son, a husband, a brother, lost forever. On T-ground, the first air raids brought the brutal reality of total war to the civilian population. Families huddled in Anderson shelters in their gardens or in public shelters, listening to the drone of bombers and the crump of explosions, praying they would survive the night. The courage of the ordinary citizen, the firefighter, the air raid warden, the nurse, the ambulance driver was as vital as that of the pilots in the sky. They were all on the front line now. This was the opening chapter of a battle that would rage for months. In these first few weeks, the RF was pushed to its absolute limit. Airfields were cratered, hangars were burning, and the casualty rate among pilots was terrifyingly high. The margin between victory and defeat was the Luftwaffe, confident in their numbers and experience, believed they could wear down the British defenders. But they had underestimated something crucial: the resilience of the British people and the indomitable spirit of their few. Against all odds, the RAF refused to break. For every plane lost, another seemed to take its place. For every pilot who fell, another stepped forward to take his turn in the cockpit. The Battle of Britain had begun. The stakes could not have been higher. It was a desperate struggle for survival, a fight for the future of a nation and, indeed, the world. The roar of a Merlin engine in a Spitfire became the sound of hope. The vapor trails in the sky were lines of defiance. This wasn't just a battle of machines. It was a battle of wills, fought with incredible courage by a small band of heroes in the sky and a nation of lions on the ground. Their finest hour was just beginning. In the darkest days of 1940, with Nazi Germany's shadow stretching across Europe, one voice roared in defiance. A voice that would not only define a century, but also forge the very soul of a nation on the brink of collapse. This is the story of how Winston Churchill, through the sheer power of his words, turned Britain's desperation into its finest hour. Imagine the scene. May 1940. France is falling. The British army is cornered at Dunkirk, facing annihilation. A German invasion of Britain seems not just possible, but imminent. Fear was a palpable force, a cold dread gripping every household. The government was even secretly discussing a negotiated peace with Hitler. In this moment of supreme crisis, Churchill, newly appointed as Prime Minister, stepped up to the microphone. His first address to the House of Commons as Prime Minister on May 13th was not one of soothing platitudes. It was a stark, brutal declaration of intent. He told the world, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." There was no sugarcoating the reality. He promised a long, arduous struggle, a war against a monstrous tyranny. For a public accustomed to political promises, this raw honesty was electrifying. It was a call to shared sacrifice, a challenge that, instead of demoralizing, began to galvanize the British spirit. He wasn't just a politician. He was a warrior, calling his people to arms. Then came Dunkirk. While the miracle of the little ships was a testament to civilian courage, the strategic situation was a catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been rescued, but they had left behind all their heavy equipment. Britain was vulnerable, its army disarmed. It was in this context, on June 4th, that Churchill delivered perhaps his most iconic speech. Speaking to a tense parliament, he recounted the events of the evacuation not as a defeat, but as a miracle of deliverance. He acknowledged the gravity of the situation, the colossal military disaster. But then, the famous crescendo began. His voice, a low growl rising in intensity, promised unflinching resistance. "We shall go unto the end," he declared. "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be." And then the lines that would echo through history: "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." These weren't just words. For the millions listening on their radios, they were a solemn vow. In homes across the country, people stood up. Tears streamed down faces, not of despair, but of pride and renewed determination. Churchill had taken their deepest fears and transformed them into a defiant roar. He gave them a script for courage. He told them how they would act, and they believed him. The world, listening in, heard not the voice of a nation on its knees, but of a lion wounded yet unbowed. Just 2 weeks later, as France signed its armistice with Germany, Britain stood completely alone. The threat was no longer abstract. It was just 21 miles across the English Channel. On June 18th, Churchill spoke again, preparing his people for the impending German onslaught, the Battle of Britain. He knew this would be the ultimate test. He framed the struggle not just as a battle for Britain, but for the future of civilization. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us, he warned. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Then came the passage that would name an era. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth lasts for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. Their finest hour. With this single phrase, Churchill reframed the terror of imminent invasion into a moment of historic destiny. He empowered every citizen, the factory worker, the farmer, the air raid warden, the pilot, with a sense of purpose. Their individual struggles were now part of a grand, heroic narrative. This wasn't about mere survival. It was about earning a place in history. The speech was a masterpiece of psychological leadership, transforming a nation of potential victims into a nation of heroes. As the summer of 1940 wore on, the Battle of Britain raged in the skies. Day after day, the young pilots of the Royal Air Force, outnumbered and exhausted, scrambled to meet the Luftwaffe. The fate of the nation rested on their shoulders. The public would watch the dogfights from the ground, their hearts in their throats. On August 20th, amidst the height of the battle, Churchill paid tribute to these flyers. He was touring a fighter command operations room and was deeply moved by the intensity of the fight and the youth of the pilots. Later in Parliament, he articulated the nation's profound gratitude. He spoke of the ongoing battle, the immense stakes, and then he delivered the unforgettable line, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." In that one sentence, he immortalized the few. He captured the immense debt of a nation of 48 million people to a small band of a few thousand airmen. It was a line that resonated with perfect clarity and profound emotional truth. It wasn't just a poetic turn of phrase. It was a precise, heartfelt acknowledgement that gave a name and a legendary status to the brave pilots who were, at that very moment, saving Britain from invasion. The line immediately became a national slogan, a symbol of immense courage against impossible odds. Through these speeches, Churchill did more than just communicate information. He conducted the emotions of a nation. He was a master of language, using simple, powerful Anglo-Saxon words. He spoke not in the abstract language of politics, but in the visceral language of struggle, honor, and destiny. His words were his primary weapon, while Spitfires and Hurricanes fought in the skies. Churchill's rhetoric fought the war on the front lines of the human heart, battling despair, doubt, and the temptation to surrender. He understood that leadership in a crisis is not just about making decisions, it's about shaping belief. He convinced the British people, in a watching world, that victory was not only possible, but it was their duty. He transformed fear into unity, and that unity into an unbreakable strength. The destiny of a nation was shaped not just by bombs and bullets, but by the defiant spirit of a leader who knew that in the end, the right words could be the most powerful weapon of all. 1940. Europe is cloaked in darkness. France has fallen, and the might of the Nazi war machine stands poised on the shores of the English Channel, ready to deliver the final, crushing blow. Hitler, confident in his inevitable victory, offers Britain a peace deal, a deal that would see the swastika flying over a conquered continent, a deal that would secure his dominion for 1,000 years. All Britain has to do is accept its fate. But in London, one man, Winston Churchill, says no. This single word, this act of pure defiance, will change the world forever. Hitler is furious. He unleashes the full power of his Luftwaffe, his air force, to bomb Britain into submission. He calls it Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of the British Isles. The skies over southern England become a chaotic battlefield. The Royal Air Force, the RF, though heavily outnumbered, rises to the challenge. Young pilots, barely out of their teens, climb into their Spitfires and Hurricanes, day after day, night after night. They are what Churchill famously called the few. The Battle of Britain rages through the summer and into the autumn. The relentless German bombing raids target airfields, radar stations, and eventually, cities like London in what becomes known as the Blitz. The goal is to break the RAF and terrorize the British people into surrender. But it doesn't work. The British spirit, far from breaking, hardens like steel. Londoners sleep in subway tunnels. Volunteers pull survivors from rubble. And through it all, the RF fights on. By mid-September, Hitler realizes his plan is failing. The Luftwaffe is taking unsustainable losses. He cannot achieve the air superiority needed to launch a successful sea invasion. The English Channel remains a formidable barrier, guarded by the Royal Navy and the unwavering pilots of the RF. On September 17, 1940, Hitler makes a fateful decision. He postpones Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. He doesn't cancel it. Not yet. But in reality, the invasion will never happen. Britain has survived. This moment is more than just a military victory. It's the pivot point of the entire Second World War. Had Britain fallen, or had Churchill accepted that peace deal, history would have taken a terrifyingly different path, and Nazi-dominated Europe would have become a reality. There would be no Western Front, no base of operations from which to fight back. The flame of freedom in Europe would have been extinguished, but because Britain held on, it became something extraordinary. A massive, unsinkable aircraft carrier anchored right off the coast of occupied Europe. It was a fortress, a sanctuary, and a staging ground. From this island nation, the war against Hitler could continue. Governments in exile from Poland, France, Norway, and other conquered nations found a home in London. Their soldiers, sailors, and airmen joined the fight alongside the British, forming a multinational force dedicated to liberation. Britain became the hub for intelligence operations, with codebreakers at Bletchley Park working tirelessly to crack German codes like Enigma, giving the Allies a crucial advantage. It was the base for daring commando raids that harassed German forces along the European coastline. And it was the home of the BBC, whose broadcasts pierced through Nazi propaganda, sending messages of hope and defiance to the oppressed peoples of the continent. Across the Atlantic, another giant was stirring. The United States, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, watched the events in Europe with growing alarm. Roosevelt saw Churchill's Britain as the last bastion of democracy in Europe, while America was officially neutral. Roosevelt knew that a Nazi victory would pose a grave threat to the entire world, including the United States. He began to find ways to help. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941, it allowed the U.S. to supply Britain and other allied nations with food, oil, and war materials. America became, in Roosevelt's words, the arsenal of democracy. Billions of dollars worth of supplies flowed across the Atlantic, sustaining Britain's war effort when it was most vulnerable. This economic lifeline was only possible because Britain had not surrendered. Then came December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States was thrust into the war. Now, the full industrial and military might of America could be brought to bear against the Axis powers. And where would this mighty force gather to take the fight to Hitler's fortress Europe? The answer was obvious. Great Britain! The British Isles transformed into a massive military camp. Millions of American soldiers, or GIs, arrived, filling towns and villages across the country. Airfields were constructed at a dizzying pace, soon hosting thousands of American bombers and fighter planes. The combined bomber offensive, a joint effort by the RF and the U.S. Army Air Forces, began to systematically dismantle Germany's war industry from the air. This incredible buildup of forces was all leading to one single, monumental event: the liberation of Europe. The planning for D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was one of the most complex logistical undertakings in human history, and it was all orchestrated from Britain. On June 6, 1944, The largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled left the shores of southern England. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy. This was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. The foothold they gained in France, made possible by years of preparation in Britain, allowed the Allies to pour in troops and supplies. They began the long, hard fight across France, through Belgium and the Netherlands, and finally, into Germany itself. Without Britain as the staging ground, D-Day would have been impossible. The liberation of Western Europe simply could not have happened. Think about the alternative, a world where Hitler's peace offer was accepted, a Europe under permanent Nazi rule, a world where the Holocaust might have continued unchecked, where the ideals of liberty and human dignity were crushed under the boot of totalitarianism. America might have eventually faced a powerful, consolidated Nazi empire alone, a conflict of unimaginable scale and horror. All of this was prevented by that one decision, that one moment of courage in 1940, Churchill's refusal to surrender. Backed by the resilience of the British people and the heroism of the RF, didn't just save Britain, it saved the future. It demonstrates a powerful truth, that sometimes the fate of the world can hinge on a single act of moral clarity. It's the idea that standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible, even when you stand alone, can change the course of history. That one voice, saying no to tyranny, can echo through the ages and give freedom a fighting chance. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story of defiance and its impact as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. See you in the next video.